The courtroom in Birmingham, Alabama, was packed to the brim, a restless energy simmering beneath the surface. Rows of wooden benches groaned as people shifted, whispering among themselves, their murmurs barely contained. The air was thick, tense, heavy, suffocating, like the moments before a storm breaks. At the front of the room, the prosecutor's table was piled high with legal pads and documents, a fortress of paperwork. Across from it, the defense attorney sat composed, his posture unwavering. His client, a former police officer, reclined in his seat, too relaxed for a man accused of murder. But all attention, all breath, all weight of the room was on the witness stand. 14-year-old Jameer Matthews sat rigid, his fingers clasped so tightly his knuckles had turned pale. His dark eyes flickered toward the jury, 12 strangers with unreadable faces, watching, waiting. Just a few feet away, his mother sat frozen, her hands gripping the edge of her seat. The only sign she was even breathing was the slow, trembling rise and fall of her chest. "State your name for the record," the prosecutor instructed, his voice steady but gentle. Jameer swallowed, adjusting the microphone. He wanted his voice to come out strong, but it wavered instead. "Jameer Matthews," he said. "And how old are you, Jameer?" 14. The prosecutor nodded, his face carrying that careful expression adults wore when trying to be gentle. But Jameer saw through it. This wasn't kindness. It was strategy. "You understand why you're here today, right?" Jameer's throat constricted. He didn't need reminding. His father, Darnell Matthews, had been a man who fought for those without a voice. A man who had once told him, "If you see something wrong, you speak up. You don't let fear win." But fear was winning now. His hands curled into his jeans, forcing himself to say the words, "I'm here because my dad was killed." A hush fell over the room, a deeper silence than before. The defense attorney barely looked up, just tapped his pen against the desk, indifferent. And Officer Brian Keating, the man on trial, the man Jameer had come to testify against, remained motionless, his face unreadable, his hands folded neatly in front of him. The prosecutor took a step closer. "Tell us what you remember from that night." Jameer closed his eyes, dragging the memory forward. It was never far. It lived in him, just waiting for moments like this to surface. "It was late," he began, voice hushed. "Almost midnight. My dad had just left a meeting. He was working on something, a case about a kid who got arrested for something he didn't do." His voice faltered, but he pressed on. "We stopped at a gas station. My dad was at the pump, and I went inside to grab a soda. And then," the words stuck. The sound echoed in his mind, the sharp, unforgiving crack of a gunshot. The way time had stretched and warped in those few seconds. The courtroom waited, holding its breath with him. Jameer cleared his throat. "I heard the shot. I ran outside. My dad was—" His voice caught, but he forced it out. On the ground, there was blood, and the man standing over him had a gun. The prosecutor let the silence stretch before speaking again. "Do you see that man in this courtroom today?" Jameer's eyes snapped toward the defense table. Officer Keating met his gaze, expression still, unshaken. "Yeah," Jameer said, his voice steady now. "It's him." A ripple of murmurs spread through the courtroom. The judge lifted a hand, commanding silence. The prosecutor took another step forward. "Officer Keating claims your father threatened him, that he feared for his life. Did you see anything that suggested your father was violent?" Jameer's jaw tightened. "No," he said, his voice firm. "My dad wasn't like that." The prosecutor nodded. "Did he have a weapon?" Jameer's fingers dug into his knee, his heart thudding against his ribs. "Number, he didn't have anything." The prosecutor turned toward the jury, letting the weight of those words settle. But before he could continue, the defense attorney shifted, adjusting his tie, his voice calm, calculated. "Objection, Your Honor," he said smoothly. "The witness was inside the store at the time of the shooting. He can't possibly say for certain what happened before he ran out." The judge, Judge Evelyn Carter, barely reacted. She turned toward the prosecutor, her expression unreadable. "Sustained. Rephrase the question." Jameer's stomach twisted. Something about the judge felt off. Not her posture, not her voice. Those remained measured, professional. But the way she looked down at her notes, as if this was just another case, as if she already knew the ending. The prosecutor cleared his throat, refocusing. "When you ran outside after hearing the gunshot, did you see your father do anything aggressive?" Jameer shook his head. "No." "Did you hear him say anything?" He hesitated, sifting through the haze of memory. The gas station lights had cast long, stretching shadows across the pavement, warping the world into something unreal. But his father's voice, he could still hear it. "Yeah," Jameer said. "He said, 'Please.'" The word hung in the air, heavy, suffocating. The prosecutor leaned in. "Just please?" Jameer nodded. "That's all I heard. Just please." From the front row, his mother let out a shaky breath. The defense attorney adjusted his pen, preparing for his next move. But the prosecutor pressed forward. "So let's be clear," he said. "Your father's last words weren't a threat. He wasn't attacking anyone." Jameer swallowed hard. "He was begging," he said, voice barely a pavement, warping the world into something unreal. But his father's voice, he could still hear it. "Yeah," Jameer said. "He said, 'Please.'" The word hung in the air, heavy, suffocating. The prosecutor leaned in. "Just please?" Jameer nodded. "That's all I heard. Just please." From the front row, his mother let out a shaky breath. The defense attorney adjusted his pen, preparing for his next move. But the prosecutor pressed forward. "So let's be clear," he said. "Your father's last words weren't a threat. He wasn't attacking anyone." Jameer swallowed hard. "He was begging," he said, voice barely above a whisper. A murmur swept through the courtroom, a wave of shifting reactions. The defense attorney exhaled, standing smoothly. His suit was crisp, his tone carefully measured. "Jameer," he said, "I know this is difficult, but you were inside the store when the incident happened. Is it possible that your father reached for something? That the officer thought he saw a weapon?" Jameer's chest tightened. He knew what they were doing, trying to twist the truth, to turn his father into a threat, even in death. He shook his head, his voice unwavering. "No." The defense attorney studied him for a moment. Then, with a quiet sigh, he sat back down, as if he'd just planted enough doubt. Jameer could feel it happening. The way the jury shifted, the way their expressions flickered, the way the air in the room changed, as if truth alone wasn't enough. Judge Carter remained still, watching, and for the first time, Jameer really looked at her. She wasn't old, maybe mid-50s. Her dark hair, streaked with gray, was pulled into a perfect knot. Her black robe sat stiff against her shoulders. She had the look of someone who had seen too much, done too much, and made peace with it. But then, just for a second, something flickered across her face, a hesitation, a memory. It was gone too fast to tell. The prosecutor adjusted his tie, pushing forward. "Jameer, do you remember what happened after the police arrived?" Jameer clenched his toward the jury, but Jameer's eyes stayed locked on the judge. And that's when it happened. A flicker, so quick, so faint. But there, Jameer noticed it before he even fully understood it. The way Judge Carter's fingers tightened, her jaw tensed, small, nearly imperceptible movements, but enough to set his instincts on fire. She knew something. She had been pretending all this time, but now in this moment, She couldn't completely hide it. And suddenly, Jamir knew. This wasn't just about one corrupt cop. This was bigger, much bigger. His heartbeat pounded in his ears as his gaze darted between Judge Carter and Officer Keating. There was something unspoken between them, something buried just beneath the surface. The judge's eyes flickered, just for a second, but it was enough. She wasn't looking at him anymore. She was looking past him, like she was already 5 steps ahead, like she knew exactly how this was supposed to end. Jameer's breath caught. His father had always told him, people will lie with their mouths, but their eyes will always tell the truth. And in Judge Carter's eyes, Jameer saw it. Fear, guilt, a secret she had carried for too long. The prosecutor's voice droned on, but Jameer wasn't listening anymore. Something was wrong. The defense attorney had been too quick to dismiss him. The judge had barely reacted to his words. And Keating sat there like a man who knew, without a shadow of a doubt, that he would walk free. He wasn't nervous. He should have been. And then, like a dam breaking inside him, Jameer understood. Keating wasn't scared because he didn't have to be. The system was already working in his favor. The judge, the lawyers, the jury. They were all just pieces of a machine that had been rigged from the start. The realization sent a cold wave of anger through him. His chest tightened. But then his father's voice came back to him, calm, steady, unwavering. If you see something wrong, you speak on it. You don't let fear win. Jameer licked his lips. His hands were clammy. His heart was a wild drum in his chest. But he straightened his back. He locked eyes with Judge Carter. And then, with a voice louder than he thought himself capable of, he said it. You're the killer. The courtroom turned to ice. The air itself seemed to crack under the weight of his words. Gas rippled through the crowd like shock waves. The prosecutor froze, his mouth hanging open. The defense attorney's pen slipped from his fingers, clattering against the table. The jurors stiffened, hands gripping their armrests, eyes wide in disbelief. Even Keating, so calm, so composed, tilted his head just slightly, just enough to betray the fact that he had not been expecting that. But Judge Carter? She barely moved. Her fingers twitched against the gavel. Her lips pressed into a thin, pale line. The tension in the room thickened, suffocating, waiting. Jameer could feel his mother's breath hitch behind him. He could hear the hushed murmurs of spectators, the rustling of fabric as people shifted, uneasy. But none of it mattered, because Judge Carter still hadn't said a word. That flicker in her eyes, it was back. That flash of something she had fought so hard to keep buried. Recognition, guilt, fear. And suddenly the puzzle pieces clicked into place. The way she had dismissed key evidence. The way she had ruled in Keating's favor time and time again. The way her hands clenched every time his name was mentioned. She knew. Jameer's throat was dry, but his voice was steady. You knew. The room exhaled, not in relief, but in shock. The defense attorney shot up from his chair, his voice cracking with desperation. Objection! Your Honor, this is an outrageous accusation, from a child no less. But it was too late. The damage was already done. The courtroom wasn't just watching anymore. They were listening. For the first time, Jameer wasn't the one who looked scared. Judge Carter was. Her hands remained still on the bench, but Jameer saw it. The tightening of her shoulders, the way her throat bobbed as she swallowed. She was rattled. When she glanced toward the defense table, she did it too quickly. And for the first time, Keating wasn't relaxed either. His jaw clenched. His eyes darted toward the judge, his composure fracturing. He was waiting for her to fix it, to take control. But she didn't, because she couldn't. The room had already changed. The prosecutor hesitated before finally speaking. Your Honor, perhaps we should take a brief recess. No! Too sharp. Too fast. Judge Carter realized it too and cleared her throat, forcing her voice into something steadier. "Proceed," she ordered, but the cracks in her facade were starting to show. The prosecutor turned back to Jameer. "Son, I need you to clarify. What do you mean by that statement?" Jameer's heart slammed against his ribs, but his voice didn't waver. "My dad wasn't just killed." His jaw tightened. "He was targeted." A murmur spread through the courtroom, like a wave of electricity sparking through the crowd. Judge Carter's hand shot up. "That's enough, young man." But Jameer's mother stood before he could sit down. The room turned. She wasn't yelling. She wasn't crying. She just stood there, her hands trembling, her face pale but set with a quiet, immovable force. And then she asked the question no one else had dared to. "How do you know Officer Keating, Judge?" Silence. A silence so thick, Jameer could hear the faint buzz of the overhead lights. Judge Carter didn't answer. She didn't have to. Jameer saw it in her face, the way her breath hitched, the way her eyes flickered toward Keating for just a fraction of a second. But that was all it took. The prosecutor turned to the bench. "Your Honor, I think we—" "I said that's enough!" Judge Carter's voice cracked like a whip, but she was unraveling. Her hands gripped the gavel so tightly that her knuckles turned white. Jameer's pulse pounded in his throat. He didn't know the full story, not yet, but he knew one thing. This wasn't about one case. This wasn't about one shooting. This was about protection, about power, about a system built to let men like Keating walk free. And now, the cracks were finally showing. Judge Carter stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "This court is adjourned." And then she walked out. She didn't look at Keating. She didn't look at Jameer. She just left. And in her absence, the courtroom erupted. The jury exchanged anxious glances. The prosecutor leaned in, whispering hurriedly to his team. Spectators murmured, some already reaching for their phones. The judge had walked out. That wasn't supposed to happen. Jameer sat frozen in the witness chair. His mother's grip tightened on his shoulder, but this time, it wasn't fear in her fingers. It was something else. A shift, a break in the pattern. Keating still hadn't moved. His face was unreadable, but his eyes, they flickered with something dangerously close to panic. The defense attorney yanked at his collar. "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure Judge Carter will return soon." "She ran," the words came from the jury. A whisper, but loud enough to shift everything. The prosecutor straightened, his jaw tightening. His voice was firm when he spoke. "We motion to proceed without Judge Carter. We request an emergency replacement and continue deliberations immediately." A beat of silence. Then the bailiff spoke. "Court will reconvene in 30 minutes. 30 minutes later, a neutral judge took the bench. The jury deliberated for hours. Jameer sat beside his mother, staring at the wall, waiting. He didn't pray. He didn't know if anyone was listening, but he thought of his father. And when the jury returned, the foreperson stood. "We, the jury, find the defendant." A pause, then, "Guilty." The courtroom erupted. Gasps, murmurs, and the frantic scribbling of reporters' pens filled the air as the reality of the verdict settled over the room. At the defendant's table, Keating's carefully composed mask finally shattered. His fingers curled around the edge of the table, knuckles turning white. His lips parted slightly, his breath shallow, his eyes wide with something dangerously close to disbelief. He had been so sure, so certain the system would shield him once again. But this time, it hadn't. His attorney exhaled sharply, pressing his fingers to his temple, as if trying to force away the weight of failure. There was nothing left to argue, nothing left to spin. The damage had been done, and no clever legal maneuvering could erase it. Jamir's mother slowly collapsed into her seat, her trembling hands covering her mouth. And for the first time in a long, long time, her shoulders didn't carry the same unbearable weight. A piece of the grief she had carried for so many years seemed to lift, just enough for her to breathe. Across the room, the prosecutor gave a firm, satisfied nod. The bailiff approached Keating, motioning for him to rise. The officer hesitated for a moment, as if his body refused to acknowledge what had just happened, but there was no escaping it now. This was real, a conviction, a true, undeniable conviction. And yet Jamir couldn't bring himself to celebrate. Not yet. His eyes drifted toward the doors. Judge Carter was gone. She had walked out the moment the walls started closing in, disappearing before she could be forced to answer for her part in all of this. And Jamir knew, deep in his gut, that this wasn't over. 1 week later, the story was everywhere. News stations ran headline after headline. Former officer Brian Keating convicted of murder. Judge walks out of courtroom after shocking accusation. Was justice almost denied? The entire country was talking about Keating, about Carter, about a system that had allowed them to operate unchecked for so long. The case had become something bigger than any of them. And then, late one night, Jamir's mother got a phone call. Judge Carter had resigned. No press conference, no statement, no attempts to clear her name. She was just gone. And that told Jamir everything he needed to know. She ran because she was hiding something. Maybe she hadn't pulled the trigger herself, but she had protected the people who did. She had made sure justice was never an option until now. His father was still gone. Nothing could change that. But for the first time, the truth hadn't died with him. And maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something different. Because justice isn't just about one case. It's about breaking the cycle. It's about tearing down the system that keeps men like Keating safe. It's about refusing to let silence win. If you believe in standing up for what's right, if you believe that stories like this deserve to be told, then don't just watch. Be part of the conversation. Like, comment, subscribe. Because the truth is powerful, and the world needs to hear it.